Okay, I sent back this afternoon worksheet number 2 to you, and I will get 3 and 4 back to you real quick, sort of during the weekend at some point. There's some other deadlines. I have to do things as chair that have to be done like right away, but I'll get those back to you, and then I'll be uploading 5 and 6 pretty shortly as well, so you can get started on those as well. Again, those worksheets are all different than what I used last semester, so I have to sort of reinvent the wheel, right? Sorry about Monday. It's just, I got my flu shot this weekend, and the CDC says it's not supposed to make you sick, but everybody you talk to says that it does sometimes. All I can say is that I just felt like somebody had kicked my stomach out on Monday, and no gory details because there really weren't any other than that. Just suffice to say, I don't like calling in sick, and what we'll end up doing to make up for it is something similar to that Klaus Sluter recording that I made, right? We'll pick a section further down the road, and in lieu of class, we'll have a sort of online section. There won't be a homework assignment attached to it, but what it will do will be to make up for the missed class. And that way, you're getting what you pay for, which is what they worry about upstairs, okay? So expect that. The other thing, of course, as you know on the syllabus, there's a couple days I'm going to be out of town. I leave on the 2nd, which is a Tuesday, and I come back on the 9th, which is a Tuesday. So we'll miss Thursday the 4th. And then I think that works around the academic Monday, which is a Tuesday, right? On Tuesday the 9th, your Monday classes meet because there are no classes on Monday the 8th. So we'll miss that one too because I'll be on a plane. Right, I won't be back here by 5 o'clock on that Tuesday. Okay, so for those things as well, there'll be some makeup exercises too. All right, so those things are forthcoming. We'll pick up where we left off a week ago after the long discussion about the next step of the research assignment. If you weren't here last Thursday, be sure you reread or read closely the bibliography step on the research assignment, because that's coming due, and that comes due while I'm away, I think. You guys email it to me to give me something to do while I'm in Amsterdam, right? So we'll talk more about that next week. We were looking at Roger van der Weyden. We're going to wrap up 15th century Netherlands, what we call late Gothic. Today we only have a few slides left. And we were looking at Roger van der Weyden, who had studied under Robert Campan. Remember, we looked at how similar the faces of the Madonnas looked in their works. And how the work on the left was made, probably, we're not sure, but seems likely was made for a member of the Archers Guild of Brussels, because their patron saint was St. George, a military saint from the Middle Ages. And the work is inky-dinky tiny, right? Fits in your hand, tiny, postcard sized, and meant for private use, right? Private devotions, perhaps daily, right? At the same time, these works that are for private devotions and have that function also function as luxury objects, right? Like the very rich hours of Jean de Berry. On the right, a public work, or semi-public work, made for another military guild in the city of Leuven, which is right next door. Literally right next door. The train takes 10 minutes, and most of that is speeding up and slowing down, right? Leaving Brussels and coming into Leuven. And for another militia guild, in this case, the Crossbowmen's Guild of Leuven. Roger van der Weyden had a job in Brussels as the official painter for the city of Brussels. And this is probably what brought him into contact with both of these groups, right? Because he was a functionary of the city. And the two cities are actually very closely linked administratively as well. If you want to read more about it, I wrote an article on this a number of years ago, right? What I had to say about it at one point. But the one on the right was an altarpiece, meant for more public display, so it's significantly larger. It's larger than you even see it here, right? It's about twice that big. The figures are roughly life-sized. And it sat behind the altar of the chapel that was the meeting place of the crossbowmen of Leuven. Because each of these military guilds were more than just, archers and whatnot. they actually had a religious devotion as well, right? And so for the cross moment of Leuven, he makes their altarpiece, and their patron saint was the Virgin of Sorrows. A particular aspect of the character of the Virgin Mary was the focus of their prayers and devotions. And so that's what Roger focuses on, is the sorrowful Virgin, and picks for that one of the most intensely sorrowful moments of her life, which we talked about with Giotto, right? This idea that a mother has to watch her son die. Extraordinarily sorrowful, right? He paints into the corners of the altarpiece little crossbows that relate to the Crossbowmen's Guild, and then he intensifies that emotional impact. It's still every bit as detailed as the little picture on the left or anything Van Eyck had painted. But with our picture on the right, or I should say, right, this one is in Madrid. Their picture on the right, you'll notice that he doesn't give it any landscape. There's no sort of setting for it. That instead of looking as if this is taking place in some sort of distant landscape, like our little picture on the left, it appears as if it's in like this gilded box that has just enough space for the figures to fit in, a little bit of ground at the bottom, but there's no sort of sky in the background, no sort of distant background. It's artificial as a setting for this particular scene. And it makes it almost look like a stage set, maybe, right? Like a sort of tableau that's being acted. Or perhaps like painted sculpture. Most sculptures of the time period were painted if they were in wood. Stone sculpture was not as readily painted, or not always at least. Sluder's was, but other ones weren't. But it sort of has this artificial quality in that he's not setting it in any kind of natural landscape. And part of the reason for doing that is that what Roger wants you to focus on is the emotions of the figures. If indeed as we know, the patron saint of the saint that was worshipped by the patrons, the people who paid for this, was the sorrowful Virgin, then sorrow is a leitmotif, right? It's a recurring theme within the picture. And what Roger van der Ven does do is for us to share that sorrow, to understand that sorrow. And he doesn't want things to distract us from it. So by choosing to put it in a box, what you end up doing is there's nothing to look at but the figures. And what we end up seeing with that simplified setting is a series of reactions to the death of Christ, right? And I've got some wonderful details. We can see some of this if Wi-Fi would participate. There we go. So we see the Virgin Mary in blue. She's fallen into the arms of St. John in red on the left. And it's similar cast of characters to what we saw in Giotto's Lamentation, right? Mary Magdalene on the far right at the feet of Christ. Various other figures around, including Nicodemus, who supplied the money for the grave of Christ, and Joseph of Arimathea, another follower of Christ, and two other women named Mary that we know through various sources were around. And you can see as we look at this is one of the other Marys, right? That we have four women named Mary here. Look at the tears streaming down her face as she tries to dry them. Look at the detail of the redness on the edge of her eyelid, right? As a woman who's been weeping. And like Van Eyck, he's interested in the play of light and how the light falls through those tears and sort of hits on one side and then magnifies on the side of her cheek. And other sort of wonderful details, right? Like the pin in her hat that make it look real. It makes it look almost like it's here. And remember that the scale of this, these are life-sized figures, right? So in front of it, it's as if it were there, as if you were confronted with real three-dimensional figures. He gives us this incredible range of reactions, right? John's crying as well, maybe not quite as much as the Mary behind him, but he has been crying, and you can even see he's been rubbing his eyes, right? They're red around the eyes and even up into the brow, right? And that's because he's been, sobbing extraordinarily. A little stubble on his chin as well, right? Let's see what's coming up here. Again, tears everywhere we look, right? And various stages of sadness in these different figures as we look at them. And that's what Roger wants us to focus on, right? Is the sorrow of the figures, because the sorrow of the Virgin is the overall theme. And that shared sorrow, not only with the figures that witnessed the death of the man they've been following for the last 3 years, but also us as the onlookers. At the feet of Christ is Mary Magdalene. If you know the story of Mary Magdalene, the two things that sort of pop out here, one of them, of course, is that she had once been a prostitute, right? And so two things come out of that. One is the sort of cleavage-bearing top, right? In the 15th century society, ends up being a way of sort of showing that past that was built around eroticism. But also the red sleeves was apparently a costume that was worn by prostitutes in 15th century Netherlands, right? And again, the interest in pins and these little details that make it seem that much more real. She wears around her waist a belt, a beautiful sort of locket belt, and you can see that on the side of the belt are the names Jesus and Mary, Jesus Maria. And it's sort of like her, you know, I am spiritually wedded to Christ, right? As part of her costume. The other thing about Mary Magdalene and her past that would have been kind of instantly apparent to people seeing this in the 15th century is they would have remembered another part of her life and another part of her contact with Jesus, which is where she meets him while he's attending a dinner in a house, Martha and someone else named Mary. It may have been her, but it's hard to say. And she comes up and wants to wipe his feet with her hair, with an ointment jar. Wants to sort of anoint his feet with oil. And so she stood at his feet and opened up this ointment jar, which, as you can see, is held right behind her, by the figure directly behind her. And there's this idea of figures at the death of Christ remembering the moments they had when he was alive. We saw that with Giotto doing the same thing. That Mary Magdalene here at the feet of Christ is probably remember the time that she had her hair, which is now, of course, covered up because she's better now, right? She's saved. But remembering the time when she dipped her hair in the oil and wiped Christ's feet, and now she's looking down at the scarred and bloody feet of Christ. And I think we're intended to project onto this as she's recalling that moment of her past, right? All of this then focuses on the Virgin Mary who has fainted dead away. And you'll notice Roger's arrangement of the composition is really sort of spot on. It's really nicely laid out and thoughtfully laid out. So not only does the Virgin Mary's blue robe, again, faithfulness to Jesus' cause, right, has to sort of let it happen. The worst thing that happened to her, she's going to let happen. You'd think it'd be much more easy to put her in a red gown because that's pain and suffering, right? But Roger's kind of savvier than that. And he's thinking about that pain and suffering through the physical emotions rather than just through these symbolisms, right? And then instead the symbolism is the symbolism of faithfulness. And against that very, very rich blue robe, she's got the white of purity, her symbol of purity around her face, but her face is almost exactly the same color as the white sheet because, you know, she's fainted. All the blood is run out of her, right? And this is happening at the same moment, of course. She's fainted dead away at the same moment that Christ is dead, right? And that's, I think, what Roger wants also us to focus on is this idea of the mirroring relationship between the two of them. And he puts their hands just right next to each other, right? Her white, soft, porcelain-like skin directly next to Jesus' wounded hand, right after he's been lowered from the cross. And so we're meant to think, okay, him and her, right? And go back and forth and compare the two of them. And then if, this took a while in Photoshop, but I did it years ago, so I can keep using it because it took so damn long to do, right? Look at the poses, right? They are in the same pose as well. So as she faints, her sort of symbiotic relationship to Jesus, right? The fact that it's his death that's causing this pain is picked up by this arrangement of the figures so that they end up in the same pose, right? So that the pain that he suffers in his body, right, she suffers in her soul. That's kind of the idea that Roger wants us to pick up from this, right? And somebody pointed this out a few years ago. I went to a conference in Leuven on Roger van der Weyden a few years back. And somebody pointed this out, and I had never thought of it before, but it's really spot on. They look like crossbows, right? If you look at the arms, we saw the little crossbows in the corner. Remember that crossbow's like a gun with the bow on it, right? That both of them, as they fall down, their arms come out, and they look, and their bodies become the body of the gun, and the arms sort of become the bow of the crossbow. That the figures themselves become sort of subtle evocations that would have been very particularly resonant and relevant to the people who paid for it, right? Well, the deposition by Roger van der Weyden wound up being one of the most copied paintings in the entirety of the 15th century. There are something like 15th, 16th century copies of this. There are something like 250 people who made different copies of this work. And it's not that the crossbowmen were that important, although they were pretty important. But it's not that so much as it's just he nailed it, right? And if we look up in Baltimore, we've got a set of sculptures in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore that are based on Roger's composition. This is one of these sort of 250 variations on the theme that Roger had innovated back in the 1430s. And there are painted versions of it as well. There are some that are in printmaking as well. But here we have a little wooden sculptural group in two pieces that take Roger's figures and sort of work it through, right? And are directly related to this. I have found only one picture of this in color because, again, these were polychromed, and that sort of drives the point home even a bit more, right? Now, this tradition of Northern European, particularly from the Netherlands, right, from the Low Countries, of painting with this kind of detail doesn't sort of disappear with the three painters we looked at, right? All we really looked at was Jan van Eyck, Robert Campen, and Roger van der Weyden, but there were dozens of others. And we could easily spend time sort of, go to the National Gallery, we've got a room full of them, right? They're pretty wonderful. We'll pick up with this tradition again in the 16th century, right? But just keep in mind that what we're seeing here in the first decades of the 15th century continues through the rest of the century. We just, as an introductory level class, don't have time to really dive into it that deeply, right? Even though this is why I do my research on it, I'd much rather talk about it than anything else, right? So we're going to sort of shift back to Italy, and to do so, I want to kind of reiterate where we've been. We were looking at International Gothic, right, which is this flourishing, international flourishing of art around 1400, based on the innovations of Siena, artists from Siena in particular, right, through Simone Martini, okay? And we saw it everywhere, and we sort of traced. There was in Germany, it was in the Low Countries, right? And then we saw, as we looked deeper into the 15th century, that up north at least, in the Netherlands, we broke free from International Gothic into this sort of realism, this hyper-realism that we've been looking at, right? Now, what we're going to see is that International Gothic stays in Italy too, right? It doesn't just spread and leave Italy behind. But even though Simone Martini leaves, there are artists in Italy that continue to paint in that sort of that old school style with the gold backgrounds, the bright colors, the sort of artificial settings, right? Those will continue into 15th century Italy as well. And so we still have some International Gothic works in 15th century Italy in the early part of the 15th century, right? And so Gentile da Fabriano down at the National Gallery is also best considered an International Gothic work in the early part of the 15th century. It's a traditional scene of the Madonna and Child with that same sort of tenderness that we saw with Giotto back in the 14th century, with the same sort of icon tradition of the gold background, right? With the tooling in the gold to make the halos, right? That changing of the surface so the gold leaf sits in the ridges to make this the patterns that we see. And again, it's this probably part of an altarpiece and the basic old tradition of Jesus on Mary's lap, with again a sort of interaction between the two of them, right? And some nice details. Well, trying. Some nice details of the two baby Jesuses in the two of them, and how very much like Giotto, Gentili di Fabriano does things that add a little bit to the meaning of the piece. So in this case, or in Giotto's case, remember he's holding her finger, which sort of makes it tender. And in Gentili's, he reaches up toward the hem of her clothing, right? That adds that sort of tender interplay between the two of them. In Giotto's, she was reaching for the rose. He was reaching for the rose, right? And she was protecting him from pricking his finger on the thorns, which were a symbol of sin, right? In Gentili di Fabriano's, it's a little hard. Underneath his left hand, on your right, he's got a butterfly on a little bitty gold chain. So that whitish thing with the dots that you see down there is a butterfly, right? And he's got it sort of trapped like a pet butterfly, if such a thing exists, right? And the point of the butterfly is also terribly symbolic because, again, we find these moments when theologians are trying to explain the mysteries of theology, right, to the layman in terms that make it understandable. And one of the things they used as an analogy for Christ's resurrection was the idea of the caterpillar. That a caterpillar lives this life, goes into the nest, the chrysalis, right? Then the chrysalis opens and it comes out a butterfly, right? Well, for Christians, this is Jesus, the fully human, right, Son of God, but fully human, going into the tomb, emerging, resurrected, no longer bound by the earth, right? That was an analogy that they use regularly. So Jesus holding on to a butterfly is a reminder of sort of his overall character, right? And the other thing that's kind of fascinating is that he's touching a part of her, the hem of her garment, where it actually says mother in Latin. It says mater, right where he's touching. So he's not just touching her clothing, but he's actually touching the word mother as he reaches up. And on the hem of her garment down below, I don't know if you can see this or not, there are the words from the Annunciation. Ave Maria, Dominus tecum, right? God is with you. Or Ave Gratia plena, Dominus tecum, right? The words from the Annunciation are at the foot, right? So 14th century tradition still kind of continuing here in the early part of the 15th century. It's part of the international Gothic style, right? In Italy as well. One of the most famous international Gothic works is this altarpiece in Florence that was commissioned for a family chapel by a man named Paolo Strozzi. So we refer to it as the Strozzi altarpiece, right? Many of our more famous families, or I should say more wealthy families, would, as works of devotion, give money to the church to support an altar that their family would use for prayer and maybe for burial, right? But this, again, like Philip the Bold, it's a good work that would help with salvation, right? And Paolo Strozzi financially supported this altar in Florence and paid for this massive, it's 8 feet across, it's massive altarpiece, right? To over his family's altar and where they would be buried. What's the subject matter here? Can you tell from looking? Does anybody have a guess? Can you make out any characters that we now recognize from having looked at a lot of religious art? It's the birth of Christ, right? So we have Jesus on the left, right, with the Virgin on the lap of the Virgin Mary. Joseph right behind him, right? Notice he's a little bit more proactive here, right? He's not kind of shuttled off to the side like we've seen him so many times, right? Who are the two people behind the Virgin Mary on the far left? Can you tell? Just think about what other works that we've seen. The other Marys, but they're usually there at the death of Christ. Who else did we see with Jesus at his birth? Do you remember?
The three, I know the term.
The wise men?
Three wise men,
The
yeah.
three wise men, okay. They're over here, right? So that's definitely him over here. But what about these two figures here? When we looked at Giotto, we saw, or not, when we looked at Duccio, we saw that there were a couple of women hanging around in the front. Remember what they were doing? They weren't from the Bible in particular. They came from other sources, but we had talked about that and seen them before. Remember they were looking at Jesus and in Duccio's, maybe I've got Duccio's coming up, but in Duccio's Nativity, Christ appeared twice. He's on the crib, and then he's again in the foreground. And there were these two women that were midwives that were attending the birth of Christ, that aren't mentioned in the Bible, but were mentioned in a lot of narrative sources outside the Bible, that became part of the way people understood it. Right? And I told the story when we looked at the Duccio work, about how one of them doubted the virgin birth and her hand withered, right? And you'll notice that they're back there, they're helping to gather the gifts from the Magi, but there's a sort of focus on their hands as well, right? So those are those two midwives that aren't part of the biblical story, but were part of the story in people's minds because they found them in other sources that had become very popular in the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. I think they are back there as well. And then, Sophia, you're absolutely right, that the three wise men, the three magi, the three kings, right? And in magi just means wise men, right? Magus is a wise man, right? And in fact, the word really is magician, right? And their wisdom came through knowledge of the laws of science, right? Which makes them magicians. But through history, they became known as kings as well, right? And so Gentile da Fabriano dresses them rather ornately, right? The three figures in the foreground that are the most sumptuously dressed are the three wise men or the three kings. So it's not, in particular, the birth of Christ, right? The nativity, per se. What it is the adoration of the Magi. That's how we often refer to this, right? The adoration of the kings, coming now to worship Christ, having followed the star to the manger to see his birth. There we go. So there they are up close. And again, Paolo Strozzi, having paid for this. Paolo Strozzi was the wealthiest man in Florence in the 1420s. He was a banker. He was floating in it, right? 1%, right? The upper 1%. Maybe even 0.01% of people in Florence, and as far as the single wealthiest man in Florence. And the work of art is something that is meant to please his particular tastes. And so International Gothic style anyway tends to be kind of sumptuous, so that's great. He's going to love that. But in addition to that, Gentile da Fabriano just pulls out the stops, and look at the fabrics in this. Right? They're really extraordinary. And we've seen sort of extraordinary fabrics going back to Simone Martini. That was a hallmark of the International Gothic style, but these are out of the world, out of this world, with the three magi. And you'll notice he gives them these incredibly ornate crowns, although the one kneeling down has taken his off, right? It's on the ground. It's just in the corner of my detail here, right, out of deference to Jesus. And as we look at the three of them as they bring their gifts, right, so the oldest one in the foreground has already taken off his crown. He's already given his gift. And the midwives in the background have his gift, right? And then the second one in the middle is in the act of kneeling and presenting his gift and about to take off his crown. And the third one on the right is not kneeling yet and still wearing his crown. So it's almost like there are three figures in different parts of the same action, right? Like time-lapse photography, right? Standing, kneeling, on his knees. Crown on, taking crown off, right? And in addition to that, there's nothing in the Bible that says how many wise men there were. Right? There are no reference to numbers there. But by this time, people said 3. Right? Sometimes you hear in the Middle Ages 5, sometimes you even hear 7. It's sort of settled down to in people's mind that there were 3 of them, and to this day we still think 3. But there really isn't any textual proof for that, right? That's just sort of become the tradition of 3 wise men. And what happened as the number sort of settled into three, the three wise men ended up being used by artists, not only in the visual arts, but in literature as well, to represent all of mankind. The idea that everyone is going to come and bow in front of Jesus. This is the Christian outlook on this, right? That eventually every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. And it's a biblical verse somewhere. And in order to represent all of mankind, what artists do in the visual arts is to make each of the three magi a different age. Now, of course, all of mankind meant only men. Sorry, ladies. Misogyny running rampant, right? But we got the old guy in the foreground, right? I don't want to say middle-aged, but adult in the middle, and somewhat youthful standing, right? So these are what we might call the three ages of mankind, right? As a way of representing the totality of the earth. And by legend, they were to have come from three very different regions as well, each representing a different region. Europe, Africa, Asia, right? They didn't know about America yet, right? Europe, Africa, and Asia. And by the end of the 15th century, we'll see actually one of them will get dark skin as well to represent that he'd come from Africa. Right? But the idea is that they've come from three different areas. They met up and traveled together. They didn't know each other ahead of time. And that's because they're meant to represent all of the earth now coming to see Jesus, right? Right. So we think that the guy in the red turban, directly behind the youngest Magus, looking directly out at us, might be a portrait of Paolo Strozzi. And that's something we've seen often in works of art, where you pay the piper and you get, that's a bad analogy. You pay the painter, you get your picture in there somewhere, right? There's no proof for this because we don't really know what he looked like. But he is kind of obviously there right in the middle of things and staring directly at us. And that seems kind of weird. And he's also in contemporary clothing, 15th century clothing, right? So that's distinctly possible that he is a portrait of Paolo Strozzi. Okay, we've been talking about Duccio already, and I wanted to look at, this is from the Maestà altarpiece where our nativity is from, but this is Duccio's adoration of the Magi. And I want you to sort of look at the two side by side to see that despite the increased complexity of Gentili's work 100 years later, all of the basic components are here, right? We've got the horses and the servants and the camels coming in from the left, right? We've got the star that has led them, and it's sort of hanging there like this weird sort of science fiction thing. Something out of Hellraiser running around, zap you in the head or something. And then there are Magi, and you can see the three ages and the crowns, and the old one is the one that's kneeling down and kissing his foot. And that's all kind of the same, right? It's just that remember that Duccio's panel is about like this, and the other one's like 8 feet long, so it's got a lot more detail in it, right? But again, they've sort of continued with all of the basics. And so if we look more closely at the Strozzi altarpiece, we can find the horses, we can find the camels, we can find other exotic animals that are meant to represent these different lands that they came from on their way to seeing Christ. You'll also notice that with Duccio, the horses don't seem to like each other too much. And they're actually sort of, giving each other the stink eye, right? In the corner here, staring at each other and sort of stamping their foot, right? As if angry at one another. And this is a theme that we often find in the adoration of the Magi images, is that since the three kings came from three different regions, they were not necessarily friends to begin with. But rather it was only their salvation, only their visit to the Prince of Peace, that made these once enemy leaders into friends, right? And there are these subtle little ways in which artists have shown this, and Duccio's is a little bit more subtle. We'll see it's there in the Strozzi altarpiece as well, picking up on this idea of the enemy kings. So his horses are a little bit more buggy-eyed, right? They're really sort of, what are you? And the kids are trying to hold them back, and they're braying at each other. And the gray one here in the middle looks a little bit frightened by all of this, But those three on the right are really sort of having their way. And we have more exotic animals floating around. And I love that there's two cheetahs in this, right? In the detail. Here's one here that's not helping the horses calm down at all, right? But there's another one back over here. And he's watching these two birds overhead that are also going at it, right? And the whole idea, of course, is that the world is a mess and needs salvation, right? This is very similar to the message that we saw with Jan van Eyck and the church that needs fixing, right? That Christ came for a reason. That's the message to the believer in the 15th century. And the reason is in this particular altar to cure peace. Notice these subtle little references to Islam, right? The crescent moon on one of the horses' heads as well. We find these sort of subtle, and Europe and the Ottoman Empire, not really the Ottoman Empire yet, aren't getting along too well. Constantinople is under siege. It will fall to Ottoman Turks in 1453, right? There's mounting tensions between Islamic countries in the West during the 15th century, and I think that some of that xenophobia sort of comes through in some of these images, right? So fighting birds, angry horses, exotic animals in the picture. What's coming up next? I like the monkey on the camel's back. There are two monkeys, I should say, on the camel's back. A pair of camels, one of them sort of hiding behind this rock. Another bird swooping down to sort of join in the fight, right? All of these images that reference sort of turmoil in the world and the exotic foreign origin of the Magi, right, are part of what he includes in this sumptuously painted and really gorgeous sort of, what do you want to say? Everything's filled with detail and color and pattern, right? And then there's a close-up of the two midwives on the back who are taking the gifts. Let's see what he brought, and opening it up, right? While the eldest Magus kisses Jesus' foot. And if we keep in mind that this is an altar piece, right, that decorated a Christian altar where the whole point of coming to the altar is to take communion, where you put Christ's body in your mouth, based on Christian theology, right? This is the body of Christ, and you put it on your tongue. He's sort of taking the body of Christ and kissing it. And that's an analogy to what we will do as well, right? Like the oldest Magus, we will come, and in a prayerful attitude, we will receive Christ, and we will have a contact with him with our mouth, right? Underneath the lobes, in the background, we see the narrative expanded, what we call continuous narrative, right? To where the story of the Magi, the three Magi, and their travels to get here is told in three different stories in the back. So the three Magi appear 4 different times in this. One under each of those archways, and again in the foreground, right? So here on the left, they're all 3 of them standing on the top of that rock in the middle. They've gotten off of their horse, and they're seeing the star in the sky. So this is the Magi here. There's the star up above, and each of them have 3 boats. One's sort of more deeply in the harbor. They're gonna, maybe they've come here with these boats, and they've gathered together, and they're about to set off on their travels. And they're here, and then outside the city gate, what we see happening is all sorts of horrors. A man's being mugged, and you can probably make that out that some guy's got his face, right? And they're going to take his money. And again, that's the idea that the world is a mess, right? And this event that is going to be the salvation of the 3 Magi is also an event that will have sort of international, if you will, world impact, right? We're going to help all these different problems. And then we see in the center, I'm not going to show you all 3 of them, the retinue of the Magi, that whole group that's traveling with them as they're working their way from city to city looking for Jesus, right? This is important to Christians because one of the things that happens is that he meets King Herod on the way, the Magi do. And they say, hey, we're following a star. Really, what are you looking for, King Herod says. And he goes, oh, we're looking for the king, the new king who has been born. And Herod's going, what? I'm the king. What are you doing? There's no other king here but me. And he orders that all the 2 years, how long have you been on the road? And they say, 2 years. I'm going to kill all the 2-year-old boys, right? So it's kind of an important moment that travels. And that leads to what's called the massacre of the innocents, the death of the 2-year-old boy. So there's the 3 Magi right in the middle. They're all together. I always like to group them together now, right? And they're moving, and then we have hunting birds. And we still have horses having trouble with each other, right? So and they're rearing up here, right? They're kicking at each other here, right? And he doesn't like that very much, being kicked in the chest by the other horses. So the Magi have figured it out, but the horses, the animals, still haven't yet. And that's their legacy, right? And they're moving now through the wilds, and we see some groomed fields, but we also see deer sort of jumping off into the bushes behind them. And this all then leads us to the central scene, right? So, still International Gothic, okay? Very much the International Gothic style, that sort of stylized, hyper-luxurious, gold backgrounds, luxury fabrics that seem to sort of sit flat on the surface, adding into it a certain amount of realism. That's typical of the International Gothic style. And here in the early 1420s, still very strong in Florence, in Italy, right? Almost at exactly the same time, we start to see things start to change, and change drastically in Italy, just as they changed drastically in the Low Countries. But what we'll trace today for the rest of class is to look at those changes and how the changes in Italy, while every bit as drastic, were not necessarily in the same direction as the changes that we saw in the Low Countries. So this is only, 3 to 5 years later, right, by Masaccio. It's a fresco rather than a panel painting, so it's much more colorful. But it's also a different conception of storytelling. It's a different conception of how to compose a picture. And I think it's obvious to me right out of the chute, but I've been looking at this picture for a long time, right? This is my 30th year teaching. I remember I taught this the first year I ever taught. I taught this picture, right? Do you see any differences between how they handle visual storytelling in these two different pictures? Conception of let's talk about space. How do they depict space? The idea of a three-dimensional space, a setting for the figures, a setting for the story. Right? Yeah, Jason.
It just seems more open.
Sorry?
It just seems more open.
More open.
Yeah.
Not nearly as crowded, right?
And I see the actual perspective more things.
Excellent. So perspective, right? We all know the term perspective, what we mean when we talk about perspective. Yeah, perspective is coming into play. So with Gentile Fabriano, right, if we go back into space, what happens is we go up the picture, right? And so the foreground figures are at the bottom of the picture. The middle ground figures are kind of in the middle of the picture. The background figures, even though they're smaller, and there's perspective, right? You're getting smaller, go back. But the background figures are at the top, right? So instead of going back into space this way, it goes up into space that way. Does that make sense? Right? Here, however, right, we go back into space. And he leaves a significant amount of open space, your first comment, in order to sort of establish the relationships of these figures in three-dimensional space. Right? So it has a certain stronger sense of three-dimensionality. Right? The simplicity adds a certain something else as well. I think it's easier to pick out individual figures and look at them figure by figure by figure in Masaccio's work, because it's not this sort of carpet of textile fabric that you see in Gentile. And I love the Gentile work. It sounds like I'm putting him down, right? But I really think that's a cool picture, right? But Masaccio, right? Each person wears sort of different colors. The colors are relatively rich, but they're not brocaded, right? They're not woven with pattern. And they don't flatten out on the surface like the three magi do. They seem to be modeled in our old friend chiaroscuro, right? Lights and darks, like what Giotto had done. And in fact, we know that Masaccio loves Giotto, right? So as we move back into space, you'll notice that we don't move up the picture. So there's a figure in the back on the left, and the figures on the right are somewhat closer, but they don't sort of move up the picture as they go back into space, right? They move behind that as well. And as he gives us this circle of figures in the middle, you can probably figure that that's Jesus in the middle of that, right? In pink and blue, right? The group of figures around Jesus, right, are he's not afraid for them to sit in space and sometimes even sit behind other figures, even though he's pretty good about making sure we can see all their faces. We catching that, right? And then the landscape itself also seems to have a greater sense of realism. The rocky mountains, these dead trees, right? Somebody has even been able to identify sort of where we are outside of Florence with this picture, that the mountains are apparently identifiable if you know your way around Florence well enough, because Florence sits in the hills. I don't know Florence that well, right, to verify, but I've read that once. And I think maybe for the first time in this class, we're also seeing clouds, right? Even when Giotto's frescoes that we saw online for the worksheet, right? He had blue skies, but they were just blue skies. The only clouds that were there were like, the jet trails from the angels, right? When they poof and appeared, where you might see clouds. But here we have real clouds, and they even kind of lit, aren't they? From the right side. There, you can see the sun hitting the side of the clouds, right? So that adds to this overall sense of realism, right? Great. And then Jason mentioned perspective, which we'll get to. So I've got some, that comes up, right? The idea of perspective, because this is all very important. You'll notice that he's very interested in the human figure in this, and that many of the figures are arranged in a pose where they're bearing the majority of their weight on one leg, sort of shifting their weight from one to the other. And this is especially true in the two figures we see on the right, which is, by the way, this is also a continuous narrative. So that's the same guy seen twice. And he wants us to get this because the clothing is the same, right? So the mini skirt, right, which was a 15th century style. I wouldn't wear it. It's a little too cheeky, right? But you get, yeah, right? And he's the same guy seen twice. So we see him from the back and we see him from the front. And you can probably tell that the guy he's talking to on the right also reappears in the picture, right? Can you pick him out? Because the clothing will be the same. So he's next to Jesus, to your left, on Jesus' right in the center. And that's him again in the background on the left, where he's taken off the orange and he just has the blue. So he's there 3 times, right? So one figure appears twice, one figure appears 3 times. We'll work our way through the story in just a little bit, right? One of the things that sets Masaccio apart is not only the perspective that Jason was mentioning, and will come up in a slide in a few minutes, but there's also this interest in the human figure, right? And in particular, this pose of shifting your weight to one leg, which you can see most pronounced in the miniskirt guy, because you can see his legs. But as you look at the other figures, you start to realize that almost everybody's doing this, right? Sort of shifting to one side with their weight. And this comes from the fact that what Masaccio is doing is he's looking back at ancient Roman sculpture. Remember the Renaissance, right? And how important that is for Italy, this idea of rebirth. Looking back to the glorious national historical past, right? The past of ancient Rome is an important sort of touchstone for the Italians. Not so much for Jan van Eyck, because it's not his past, right? And that's why we tend to call Van Eyck late Gothic rather than early Renaissance, because it's not about Rome, right? Masaccio has been looking at ancient Roman sculpture. And in particular, he's been looking at this pose that we call contrapposto. Now, this is an Italian term for what this pose was that had been established by the Greeks, the slide on the left, picked up by the Romans in the middle there. and now adapted and adopted by Masaccio in the 15th century. Contrapposto, okay? Contra, right, against. That's what contra means, right? Contraband, right? The Contra rebels under the Iran-Contra scandal, right? Posto, posts, counterpoised, counterposted. And the idea is that weight shift that we see Masaccio picking up is a weight shift that is about counterbalanced forces in the body, right? One leg bears the weight, the other leg relaxes, right? When used absolutely perfectly, one arm will flex and the other one will relax, but on opposite sides. So this is where we first really see contrapposto. Weight bearing, flexed, right? Crooked and flexed, relaxed, and opposite that, relaxed, right? And the idea is that within the figure, with these counterpoised, contrapposto pose, right? What you end up getting is a figure that is entirely in balance. That the flexed sides are balanced by the relaxed sides, right? And it was seen to be a very, very perfect pose. And what Masaccio is doing is reviving that, right? Now, it also brings up another issue, which is that in the Renaissance, and we're now sort of in the early parts of the Renaissance, in Masaccio's time, there was a sort of friendly rivalry between painters on the one hand and sculptors on the other, right? You looked at sculpture online with Donatello, right? The Orsan Michele sculptures, right? Sculptors tended not to paint, and painters tended not to sculpt. You focused on one or the other, and that's kind of still true to today, right? And each one tried to argue that their art was better than the other one. Sculptors said, I can do the entire figure. You can only do one side, right? Painters said, I can do landscape. I can do a setting. You can't do that, Sculptors said, I don't need the world is my landscape. And the painters said, yeah, but I don't come out all covered in mud. It just went back and forth. It was kind of a friendly rivalry. The Italian term for this is paragone, right? This is that rivalry between painters and sculptors, right? And one of the things I think that's kind of interesting about Masaccio is that he's painting like a sculptor. He's kind of showing us that I can do the figure from two sides. He's countering one of the principal arguments that the sculptors said. You painters can only paint from one side. Oh yeah, well, take a look. Right? I've got the exact same pose now, front and back. Right? That adds into this idea, the paragone, right? That's sort of his challenge for painting being the primary art form. Now, the storyline, right? The tribute money. This is where Christ is hanging out with his 12 apostles, right? And they're on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And they are approached by a tax collector who says you need to pay your taxes, right? And so that's who the kid in red is the government functionary tax collector coming to ask the Christ and his apostles to pay their taxes. Does anybody know what happened at this point? Do you know this story? What happens when the tax collector comes? Do you know, Sophia?
Doesn't he invite them to dinner and they say no, but then doesn't Jesus say that didn't the one apostle say no, we shouldn't go, but then Jesus said we should go?
Yeah.
Or something?
No, that's not said they shouldn't go, but Peter's kind of contentious, right? St. Peter says, we don't owe the government anything, right? We're separate from that, right? We are not, we don't answer to the government. We answer to you, Jesus. You are our Lord. We don't owe them squat, right? And Jesus says, and he performs a miracle. He tells Peter, go to the shore, and you will find a fish. Go and get me the fish, right? Peter goes over to the shore. He goes to the fish. He brings the fish. Reach into its mouth, Jesus says. And Jesus opens up the mouth of the fish. Don't ask me how he caught it, right? Like a bear or something, reached in and grabbed it. What do you see inside its mouth? And it's a coin, he says, and he pulls out a coin miraculously from the mouth of the fish. And Jesus says to Peter, whose face is on that coin? Oh, it's the face of Caesar, because in the Roman Empire, the current leader's face would always be on the coin, right? So Augustus would be on the coin, Caesar. Caesar's face is on the coin, right? We keep older ones, right? They're not all Obama coins or Trump coins. We have Roosevelt, right, on our dimes. Caesar's on the coin. Well, Christ says, then give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar. That's right. Pay your taxes with the coin that you've miraculously produced, and he gives it over to the tax collector. Okay? So that's the story that's going on here. That's the tribute money. You owe it in taxes or tributes, right? And so the center scene is told out, right? And notice how everybody's kind of calm, right? No great emotions or anything like that. It's just the tax collectors come in, these guys hand out, give me the money, right? And as it happens, right now, we're at that moment where Peter's mouthed off, and he said, no. And Jesus going, shut up. And he's pointing, he said, go to the Sea of Galilee. And he's going, pointing to the Sea of Galilee. And I love this little exchange because Peter's going, you mean the Sea of Galilee? And he's pointing over there as well. So these gestures, these human gestures tell the story, right? Give me, go there, you mean there, right? And everybody's sort of gesturing. It's all told through, it's a miracle, but it's told through human terms, right? And you get this exchange, yeah, Jesus is going, yeah, I meant over there. And they're pointing over to where Peter will go, right? So what's my next slide? There. I spend more time waiting for this exchange. There we are. There's that exchange, right? Christ to Peter, Peter meaning you mean over there. And then the third scene is there's Peter, and I will forgive Mazzaccio because that's a really difficult pose, right? It's not particularly well done, kneeling down like that. But there's Peter now reaching into the mouth of the fish to get the coin, right? So this is Peter now appearing a second time. And then this story concludes over on the right where Peter is now given the coin to the tax collector, still in the same pose with his hand out. So it's that same continuous narrative that we saw with the Strozzi altarpiece. But as Jason mentioned, it's also sort of an incredible space, right? Where we get this breathing room between the three stories that helps us to read it, helps us to pick out the individual figures, and even though it's a miracle, right, it's not told in miraculous terms. It's sort of told in human terms. And that's something that we're going to see as typical for 15th century Italian art, for early Renaissance art, is one, an interest in unified rational space, right? The second is an interest in humanism, right? In mankind, in telling religious stories through particularly human terms, and those human terms are based on studying these perfect examples of ancient Roman and Greek art, right? A true Renaissance, which is something we simply didn't see in Northern Europe at all, right? Now, the first thing that Jason had mentioned was perspective, right? The rules of perspective were invented right around this time. We don't know exactly when, but we have a story that was told about how. There was an architect, a very prominent architect in Italy, that was trying to make more effective presentation drawings for his clients. And he was upset with the way those three-dimensional drawings looked. And he wanted to come up with a system to draw three-dimensional objects accurately on a two-dimensional surface, right? And this became linear perspective, right? And the man who invented it was this man named Brunelleschi, this architect. And a friend of his, Alberti, Leon Battista Alberti, published it in 1435. It went into print, right? He footnoted it, right? He didn't plagiarize, he attributed his sources. Right? But it was invented by Brunelleschi around 1420, give or take, right? And the idea is, as Brunelleschi maps it out, is that, of course, everything gets smaller as it goes back in space. So if I look at Madison in the front row and Faisal in the third row, you're smaller in my visual field than Madison is, even though you're taller than if you both stand up, right? Because perspective means that the further away things get, the smaller they get. And what Brunelleschi did was he came up with a system to how to make that legitimate, rational, right? How to make it consistent into space. And so what he did was he said you should draw a horizon line as you're making your composition. The horizon line should be the height of the tallest figure in the composition, right? So in Masaccio's, and this is why they so often stand with their feet right on the front border like this. So the horizon line is going to be roughly at the forehead level of Jesus, right? And that you choose that as your horizon line, right? And in the middle of that, or at a place, wherever place you choose, is the vanishing point. And that is the point where any parallel line would converge, right? So as we see on the right, there's our figure A and the vanishing point C. And we'd imagine if we're standing, in a bowling alley and we're looking at the strips of wood that make up the bowling alley, how they come together, at a certain point, right? If we were to trace it off into space. And then he figures out a way on the left to make how things would get smaller as they move back. And that's the whole bit on the left, which is much more complicated, right? But this came up then with a rational way of rendering space. So we have a vanishing point on the horizon line to which everything vanishes. If you take drawing classes, as Madison can attribute, we make you do this, right, with great regularity, yeah? And what happens then is that you can very, very easily draw things, right, if they are facing you. The sides of my red box here will converge if I trace them out at that vanishing point, right? And once you get the system down, drawing things in 3 dimensions is really simple, right? Significantly easier, I should say, as long as the object is not too complicated, right? Like a box. It's very, very easy to draw in perspective, right? This is the scheme that Brunelleschi comes up with. This is the scheme that Masaccio has adopted, that Jason commented on. That this is actually, even though most of it is in the open air, there's that building on the right that establishes perspective. And in fact, when we look at Masaccio's picture, I brought it now to the foreground. Let's take a look. We can actually think that any of these parallel lines, anything on the front of that building would be a parallel line. They will converge at the same spot because he's used it sort of specifically, right? And the fascinating thing is because you can choose the vanishing point anywhere you want to put it, what Masaccio did is he put the vanishing point at Jesus. And this is because what happens when perspective is that your eye tends to trace it anyway. The perspective tends to direct your vision to the vanishing point, even if you don't physically trace it out. And Masaccio knows that, so the vanishing point, right, the use of the perspective is to concentrate our vision on Jesus, right? So the building on the right plays a rather prominent role here in establishing that logical, rational space that sets it apart from earlier International Gothic works. Right? And you'll notice that even the halos are in perspective. Up to this point, all of our halos have been on the surface of the panel. Right? They sort of sat in the background as if they were flat, right? Because they're not meant to be a real object, they're meant to be a symbol of holiness. But for Masaccio, the rules of perspective apply here as well. And even the halos are in perspective, so they look like pie plates that have been glued to the back of their heads and painted gold, right? Look like a Halloween costume, rather than this artificial flatness, right? And again, that adds to the overall sense of space that we have. Now, you might argue that Van Eyck looks really three-dimensional, and he's beginning to understand the idea, but there isn't one vanishing point. Right? There are 4 or 5 different vanishing points here because he's kind of intuited it, right? But he hasn't heard of this scheme yet because he's up in the Low Countries, right? And it hasn't, and if it gets published, does he read Italian? We think he did, but still, did he get his hand on that book? Right? There are very few artists in Northern Europe in the 15th century who use perspective in the Italian manner because it's not their way of approaching the world. Their way of approaching the world is through detail, closely observed detail. The Italian way of approaching the world is through rationality, perspective, the human figure based on proper proportions and contrapposto. Right? This sets the two apart really drastically. Right? So we're seeing at the same time frame, roughly around 1430, Italians and Northern European artists moving away from International Gothic, but kind of doing it in different directions. Right? The Italians, or the Northerners through oil paint and tight details, and the Italians through this sense of rationality, through measurements and proportions. Finally, this is a fresco in a family chapel. These wealthy people of Florence would support these good works. Some would buy altar pieces. Others would pay for frescoes in their family chapel. And this was part of a series of frescoes that was begun in a particular family chapel. It belonged to the Brancacci family. And this is important for us. Not only is it important to realize that most of our works of art are made for after somebody pays for it rather than before, right? Art today, the modern world, you make a work of art and you hope to hell somebody buys it. If you don't, you starve, right? Back in the day and really up until the 17th century, works of art were made on commission. They were not made on spec, right? Made like a fine restaurant rather than a McDonald's. Right? You know, and making things and hoping somebody will buy them. So this was a commissioned work of art by the Brancacci family, and as we might expect, the members of the Brancacci family got to tell Masaccio what to paint. And they chose for their family chapel the Acts of the Apostles, and in particular, the actions of St. Peter. As the primary theme, even though we get Adam and Eve at the top on the left, the primary theme is that St. Peter and his actions. And you can see in our chapel view that with the same clothes, we see him down below. We can see him off to the right around the corner as well, that he appears in all of the frescoes in the Brancacci chapel. And that's because the head of the Brancacci family's name was Pietro, right? And so they choose St. Peter because, of course, the Brancacci family, Peter Brancacci, right? It's the name saint of the patriarch of the Brancacci family, right? So Italian art moving in this sort of different direction, right? We can see some of that same style if we look at one of Masaccio's followers. He wasn't really a pupil, although he probably looked at these frescoes and studied them. Fra Angelico. So it's about a decade and a half later, 2 decades later. An Annunciation scene, yet another Annunciation scene. We've seen so many, right? Angel coming in from the left. We don't need to explain these things again, right? The same sort of scene we've seen 3 or 4 different times over. Mary hearing the words from the angel, saying that she will be the mother of God. The artist, Fra Angelico, the name Fra, do you know what the word Fra means? Brother, exactly right? He was a monk, right? And this became his nickname. I forget what his real name was, Giorgio something, I think, right? But he became known as Fra Angelico because his figures have a sort of angelic quality. Look at how beautiful and sort of porcelain-like the Virgin Mary is, typical for Fra Angelico. So the angelic brother, that's what his name means. And he belonged to a monastery in Florence, the monastery of San Marco, St. Mark, in Florence. And that's where the fresco is. Right? This is the monastery where Fra Angelico lived. He was commissioned by the abbot in the monastery to paint frescoes there. They were lucky, right? One of the great painters in Florence actually lives there. And so he paints this on the stairs that lead up to where the monks lived. This is the monastery of San Marco, and you can see that the building where the Annunciation takes place looks an awful lot like the building of San Marco. It's as if it's happening right there. Right? So, Again, knowing where it was originally seen, you can still see it there. It's a museum. Helps us to understand a little bit more about it. Fra Angelico's painting for his home, right? And this one's in public view for the different monks who live there. I'm trying to figure out where my slides are. The vanishing point is again used, and you can see those tie rods that hold together the columns and the tiling in the floor establish a vanishing point. And the vanishing point is, again, you can put it anywhere as the artist, so it's important to think of where they choose to put it. Now, in this case, it's the window. Why do you think Fra Angelico chose the window? What do we know about windows?
God, the image of God, or like God's light comes through.
God's light comes through, right? And therefore, the light of God can pass into the Virgin Mary because she's pure, right? And can pass through glass and leave glass unbroken, right? So Fra Angelico is using the same thing because you'll notice it not only points to that window, but there's obviously the light that's falling through it onto the sill of the window as well, right? It's also interesting is that she has a room in the back, a little cell, little bedroom back there, that's very similar to the kind of rooms that the brothers had at San Marcos. So she's one of them. And she's sitting in this little porch alcove area outside that room, and it's utterly empty, right? There's no, unlike Van Eyck, who just fills it with all these little details, right? Samson tearing down the temple, and God in the stained glass window, right? And all these other that make it so fascinating, right? Here, there's not much there. But I think that that's still symbolism. It's the empty room as a symbol for the Virgin Mary, right? Swept clean, if you will, because at this moment she is a virgin and not yet pregnant. So this is the idea of the building as a sort of symbol for her, right? A number of medieval theologians also referred to the virginal state of Mary as being an enclosed garden. That the Virgin Mary was not only was she the vessel most pure, but she was also a beautiful garden enclosed, sealed off from the outside world. And Fra Angelico includes a garden walled off from the outside world as part of the setting for the scene. So all of this sort of adds to the symbolism of the piece. Right? There's an inscription at the bottom that tells you, the viewer, to be sure to say a Hail Mary when you walk in front of it, right? It's sort of talking to us and telling us the proper attitude to have. Okay, we'll pick up with Fra Angelico on Monday, right? And blast our way through the rest of 15th century Italy on Monday. We're running a little bit behind, but like I said, with the day that we missed, we'll do a recorded lecture over a section of that to pick up on it, right? When I get the rest of the worksheets ready to go, I'll send you an email telling you they're available, and we'll set up a good due date based on when we get to that material as well. We have plenty of time for it. Yeah.
And next class of bibliography is due.
Is that right? The very next class we meet? Is it on Monday?
I think so.
Let me revise that probably because I want to be able to sit down and talk about it a little bit before we do it. I told you guys I would give you the sickness throw us off. So it says it's due on Monday. Thank you for the reminder. We'll probably make it due on Thursday instead, and that will give us time on Monday to do a little exercise with formatting, which I promised you guys I would do. So I'm not gonna renege on my promises. So thanks for the reminder on that.